Hello, everybody.
Exercise people.
Well, we're welcoming to you today to History Bites. This is the Amherst Historical Society lecture, not the exercise lecture. So we're really happy to have everyone here today. And my name is Bonnie Isman. I'm on the trustees for the society, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to share stories about Amherst. So we're sharing stories about Amherst today with a little bit broader focus. This is about the flood of 1936, which went from Canada all the way down to Long Island Sound. I mean, it's a really broad area was impacted. And especially today we're going to look at the areas around Northampton and Hadley. I'm so pleased to introduce Josh Shanley, who is coming to talk to us today. He was here before, so this is a return visit from Josh Shanley, and we're happy to have him. I'll turn it over to you.
I'm impressed. Thank you so much for filling the room in the middle of the day. So thank you very much. Just a little bit of background about myself. I was a firefighter paramedic here in the town of Amherst from 97 till my former captain till 2008, and then I moved over to Northampton, and I spent the last 13 years of my career over in Northampton. In Amherst and Northampton, I both was a firefighter paramedic, serving mostly on the ambulance, and also as an emergency management director. So we did a lot of the planning for a lot of the big events here in town and around the region too. So as Bonnie mentioned, what we're going to be talking about today is the 1936 flood in the Connecticut River Valley. I want to encourage you, if you have any questions or experiences, it's rare that I do these talks on this particular topic, that people don't bring photos or news clippings or have pictures of their friends, family on the roof, at some point. It's pretty common, and people often give that to me as sort of, I don't know why, but they often do. And I appreciate it because I have a kind of an ongoing archive. This particular book was written in 2020. This was kind of my COVID side project. Get me sane in the middle of all that craziness. And I'll put a plug in for the other book, because now I'm flipping them, because my first time here, as Bonnie said, I was here to talk about Cold War history. This book is actually coming out next month, and I did my last talk on this, and this book came out in 2020, and I'm here today talking about it now. So what I want to do is, just to give you a quick, and we're going till 2, right? Gotta keep an eye on the clock. 1:30?
Yeah.
I looked before I started, and it said 12:30 to 1:02, but thank you very much. I'm glad I asked. That's very awkward. So yeah, we'll end right at 1:30, and then I'll stick around if you have any questions or anything like that. But really, essentially, what we're going to do is start at a very high level. We'll look at all 410 miles, but then quickly I want to dial into what's going on here now, having spent the last 25 years of my career, coming up on 30 now, between both sides of the river. It's not over yet, so it's an ongoing story. I can give you kind of the backstory, and then where we are now, and then looking forward. It's kind of anyone's. It's a jump ball in terms of what happens next. So there's a lot. This is very much still in play. As recently as July of last year, some of the infrastructure that we're talking about today is fragile and in flux. So that's kind of a high-level view. So 89 years ago, this week as a matter of fact, we were in the middle of arguably one of the most catastrophic disasters this region has ever faced. I won't go toe-to-toe nerd with you in terms of whether it was the 1936 flood or the 1938 hurricane or the 1927 or 55. If you want to have that conversation, I'll stick around after. But arguably, the 1936 flood was the most influential in terms of the impact of this 20-day period of precipitation and then the aftermath. You can start seeing some numbers here in terms of historic events. But really, this was, this goes back a little way. This area, the Connecticut River, has a long history of flooding. I mean, it was basically after the Civil War, and as the Industrial Revolution started to really take hold here in Western Mass, we started building closer and closer and closer to the rivers. And the river didn't recognize that we were encroaching and just did what the river does. Right? The river floods, and then the river recedes. Before we started to build right up into it, the Native Americans would recognize that and move back and forth, and that was just part of the understanding. So there's a long history of flooding in this area. If you remember the 1830 flood, I'll give you extra credit. Just a few headlines, but it was 1927 that first made a big impact here. And we'll go back and forth and compare and contrast. The reason 1927 was so important because of the infrastructure on the Hadley side. And I'm going to assume everyone's familiar, if I use the Coolidge Bridge as a landmark, and then the Hadley side in the area of the Honey Pot, and then on the other side where the flooding infrastructure is the concrete and the dike along the Connecticut River on the Northampton side, and the wastewater treatment plant on the Northampton side. Everyone's on the, okay, good. That's why I like talking to people. So in the aftermath of this particular flood, it started to ramp up, and it really, people didn't have a sense of just how bad it was at the time. Normally the floods would come, the floods would go. In this case, it kept raining and the waters kept going up, and then they didn't recede. So there was a slow rolling realization that this was something different. It wasn't that the flooding was different, but the scale and the scope and the length of the time. And this just decimated everyone around this region for quite some time. This goes back, this is the 1927 flood. And again, previous to 36, this was meteorologically, this was similar to Irene. So the storm came up, parked itself in northern Vermont, and then just stayed there. It kept raining, kept raining. This was in November of 1927, so a different time period. 1936 flood was March, so it was a spring freshet, different sort of phenomenon. So this was more like Irene. Nevertheless, pretty catastrophic. So just looking at the headlines, you can get a sense of the magnitude here. So a lot of this research came from a trade journal, the New England Power Association. This area had just started being built out with electrical infrastructure. So the dams along the Deerfield were just being built out. There's 7 dams along the Deerfield at different places, and they're electrical infrastructure. So there are turbines in there, and they're generating electricity. So there's a lot of activity all up and down the Connecticut River, but also along the tributaries. So the Deerfield River had a lot of dams and a lot of destruction. They were in the process of building the Quabbin at the time, so we'll talk about that a little bit. But when this occurred, a lot of the work that they had just recently put in was being taken out. The bridges, 10 bridges along the Connecticut River, they washed off their foundations, and they turned sideways, and they turned into torpedoes, and one bridge took out the next bridge, taking out the next bridge, and it was just this domino effect. But you can get a sense of the scale and the scope here. This was not only an event that impacted the Connecticut River. The book, my publisher made me focus on the Connecticut River Valley, but really, in truth, when I do the update to the book, it's going to be Massachusetts focused and looking at the Merrimack Valley, which was arguably just as devastated. There was more infrastructure built, bigger factories, and so they were arguably hit harder. This is my backyard, so it made it easier, more relevant to me. But all up and down the 410 miles of the Connecticut River from the Canadian border down to Long Island Sound was really impacted hard. And then east to west also, as far out as Ohio, and as far south down into Virginia and DC, this is all part of the same system. And so we're beginning to focus. So by the time we're starting going from Ohio to Maine and Virginia, by the time we're done in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be at the Coolidge Bridge. So we're going to focus on that quick. But I just wanted to set the stage and give you the scope of this. Everyone was dealing with some level of this storm event. Truly a major event. Again, a lot of news clippings. I'm not going to read them to you, but just so you can see what was going on, how much damage was going on around the region, around New England, and we're just going to focus on it. Some of these maps, they're all over my office, and they're just handwritten. They're beautiful to me, right? I mean, someone actually had to. No one photoshopped this. Someone actually drew this beautiful map in detail. It's almost like an infographic. So this is what was going on at different points around the region. I haven't done the calculation. Someone could figure that out in today's dollars. It was a lot. And most important, and to sort of preview where this ends, this in the aftermath of this was a big political moment too, because the legislation that happened in the aftermath of this particular storm changed the way that we handle flood infrastructure in the United States nationwide. So now we're going to start getting a little local. This was, I believe that's apple. I'm sorry, orange. But to my previous point, I have so many photos like this where people are just standing at the edge of what is their neighborhood in awe, and they don't have this sense of, in the fire service we would say situational awareness, like what's going on, and how long is this going to stay like this? People can't get food, no one's going to school obviously, no one's going to work. There's no information coming in at this point. There was radio at this point for some people, but getting access to it, you can see some electricity in this area. But once you got out of whatever downtown there was essentially no electricity. Some of it, if you were on one of the primary routes along a railroad or along the river, you probably had some electricity at this point. Was it reliable? It's questionable even on a blue sky day. Anyone know where that one is? Yeah, I should get like lifesavers. Yes, ma'am. Yep, there it is. So that's Strong Street coming out, and that's on Pleasant. Rather, this is Pleasant Street going this way. That tells me there's a bowling alley. You can't see it here, but that's Charlie Chaplin. There was a Charlie Chaplin movie playing. It was a movie theater at the time. So in addition to all my view of this, I look at this basically from a critical infrastructure disruption. That's just my lens. But you can look at it from any number of personal stories, family stories, that kind of thing. But in addition to the flood, what the flood did was started disrupting all the critical infrastructure. So milk was transported by trains at that time, and they couldn't transport trains, so there were trains stopped various places around New England, and milk was being spoiled. So they couldn't deliver milk. So it started to develop into a food shortage issue pretty quickly. This was March 19, 1936. In terms of public health, all the water systems became contaminated. Well water became contaminated. There were rather well built out water infrastructure distribution systems at this point. New England has some of the oldest water infrastructure. I was lucky enough to go into some of the Springfield water infrastructure just last month. They're in the process of tearing that whole system down. They're pulling it out of the ground literally, and they're building a new water treatment plant there. But I got into these old sand pits where they would let the water filter through. I was too excited. But at some point, I'll share those photos. I got them on my phone. But to be in these places and to look at that infrastructure, I don't know, it just gives me chills. And I, of course, have the background in EMS and fire. Having a background in EMS and fire, and then listening to the safety and security guys in Springfield, they have reports of how many people die in these, while they're at work. And it was just like, oh well, guy fell in the pit, time for lunch, get back to work. There was no regulation, and that's a whole separate story that could drive this whole conversation. The safety and security and the work, the labor practices were basically non-existent. You want to eat, you get back in the pit, you get back to work. One of the dams on the north, the Vernon Dam, just north of the Vermont border there, about 100 guys died building that dam over a period of 7 years. Just fall into the pit, and that was just, oh well, moment of silence, get back to work. So landslides, again, in terms of disasters, the flood comes in and then the water recedes, and that's kind of just the beginning of the story. So the damage to the railroads, the electricity, the roads, it all cascades rather quickly. This was in the midst of the New Deal, so there was a big initiative in the aftermath of this to take this on, and a lot of the efforts in recovery were driven by the CCC, the community. Thank you, Lifesavers Study. Conservation Corps, yeah. So the restoration, the recovery in the aftermath of this was driven largely by those groups like that. But again, in terms of agriculture, like we're seeing today, right? When we see floods in the Connecticut River and the tributaries, agriculture in this area is really devastated, and it's a long-term recovery. I mean, it's fragile. It's fragile. So when that soil is washed away, it takes time to restore all those things. So the conversations they're having today are still very, were started a long time ago. A lot of the work I do in emergency management today, since I retired did I tell you I retired? I retired from Northampton Fire as COVID was wrapping up, and now I'm working for MEMA, the State Emergency Management Agency, and also the Department of Fire Services. And really, and they know at this point, but what that does is gets me into places. So I'm able to flash an ID and I get into a bunker, and then they know I'm going to write a book. So that's kind of keeps me out of trouble. But these systems are incredible when you get into it, but they're also incredibly fragile, and that's kind of the balance here. Bonnie and I were talking before we got started. Much of this infrastructure, in this case, the flood infrastructure is hidden in plain sight, similar to the Cold War. If you were at this talk, this stuff is here. That the Strategic Air Command is right at the top of the notch there, which is an incredible story unto itself. But similarly, in this regard, the damage is right in front of us. I live in Connecticut. I came up Route 91, and we drive by all these foundations and bridges and sort of rusting old bridges that they've turned into rail trails. Great. You'll see some of those back then. So again, I want to get pretty quickly into where we are now, but you can see these headlines from around New England. This is the Big E. A lot of the information that came out for this report in the book came from government reports in the aftermath of this. So this was USGS, Geological Survey reports. I think this one's worth. Yeah, so I'll read at you for a moment. From an evaluation of known historic records together with evidence furnished by the texture, structure, thickness, and position of recent flood sediments and materials associated with them, it is concluded that no flood as great or greater than that of March of 1936 has visited Massachusetts portion of the Connecticut Valley since civilization began there, and probably not for several hundred years prior to that time. Although there is no reason to believe that an equally or more severe flood could not occur at any time in the future, the chances for such an occurrence at any time appear to be small. So that's kind of just, that was the nugget out of that USGS report that resonated to me. And I, while I'm a professional pessimist, that's my job to, say if not when. That's, an emergency management. I don't. Resiliency is great, and I deal with environmental people who talk about offsetting greenhouse gases to reduce the impacts of climate change. I'm not opposed to all that, but I'm like, okay, that's fine, but when that doesn't work, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle it? You do you, and that's fine, that's great, but in the meantime, when the floodwaters start rising, I'm not going to be thinking about, I wish I used one less plastic bag. I do think we're past the tipping point, but that's just my professional opinion. So again, we started talking about, this is a high-level view. This is 410 miles Canadian border down to Long Island Sound. So in terms of the timing, I'm not going to get too far into it, but essentially 20 days of precipitation. And this is the river levels. This is at different points, at Hartford, at Vernon, at Holyoke. So the peak of this storm being really March 20 of 1936. The Connecticut River, I am not a hydrogeomorphologist, but I have hung around with some, and they are the Connecticut River changes drastically along those 410 miles. It gets rather wide, it gets rather deep at some places, particularly around Northfield. The French Gill Bridge, there's a shelf there that drops off about 170 feet. I'm buddies with some of the dive teams, so it gets very tricky when someone jumps off the French King Bridge, and they could be anywhere. The guys are in the process right now of looking for someone in Chicopee. I don't know if you've been paying attention to it, but the terrain, if you will, under the river changes so dramatically. There are places up north near the Canadian border that you can walk across. It looks like a creek, as they say in New York. It looks like a creek. But you can walk across, and then there are other places where there are these shells. They're creepy, like eels down there. But here, if we look at the Coolidge Bridge and south, the notch, it gets very narrow and not so deep. So it's a choke point. It's a choke point, and that becomes relevant here because in March, it had been a particularly cold winter, so there was a big snowpack base. When the rain started coming in, it had nowhere to go. The rivers and tributaries were still frozen. As it started to warm up, everything started to flood because it couldn't get soaked into the ground as would normally happen. And it started to build up, and then the ice started to break, and chunks the size of cars were breaking loose. And there's descriptions in the newspaper stories of what it sounded like. You ever hear like the ice, rocks bouncing off a pond, and there's that kind of echo that almost sounds like a laser beam kind of echo? Apparently, in my mind, the way I read these descriptions, it was like that, but times 10, because it would echo off the mountains. In the notch, the chunks were breaking loose and then forming in that choke point. So there was essentially a dam at the notch now, where the notch is, just south of where the oxbow is, essentially. And the water started to build up, and then it would break, and then a wave of water would go down south, and then it would build up again because more ice chunks were coming in behind it. So this was like an ongoing event. And you see it in the heights of the water. Two back-to-back events in terms of the storm. It wasn't one big storm, but it was one slow-moving storm followed by another slow-moving storm. But that's why you see this dip. When the storm started, the second storm started, the water was already past flood stage, so it started again, and the rivers went up really quickly. In emergency management terms, when we watch floods, when we watched Irene come through and all these other storms, and we're sitting in the EOC watching the flood gauges, we know that on the Northampton side, the Mill River is going to come up quick, right? We know in Northampton where those flood points are. They're in Florence. We know where they all are. And we know that those people have got to be informed and hopefully get out of there. They don't always do. You got to go and get them. But you know, those are kinds of things that we plan for. And we also know that in the aftermath, when the storm stops, and it looks like it does outside today, and it was a storm yesterday, that's when the Connecticut River starts coming up. So there's sort of these back-to-back events. And we've gotten to understand this timing nowadays. It wasn't until 1905, somewhere around 1905, 1910, that they started putting in flood gauges. So before that, all the history was anecdotal. It was written diaries. It was all, the water was this high. And you'll see some of that in the Quabbin photos. You know, farmers standing there next to a tree with their hand. The water was this high. And then we're saying, all right, the water must have been about 4 feet high. You know, and that was just the way it was. It was all anecdotal. So more different river gauges at different times, different places, Hartford, Windsor Locks, etc. More river gauges. Again, different places. I said this was a New England event. You can see where different rivers were at different times. Real quick, this is 1940, going back to 1640, flood levels of the Connecticut River based on anecdotal evidence and river gauges here. You can see the levels here, and basically I'll call your attention here. This was 1936 as compared to all the other events. There's some data, anecdotal data, going back to 1640, 1690, etc. But this is, again, arguably what made this particular storm worse. The 1938 hurricane, which people often think was the worst, the damage from that, long story short, was the wind. That came in and just decimated trees. You look at the photos on those storms, and the trees are flattened. The storm came right up the Connecticut River Valley and just damaged trees for miles.
2 billion trees were killed. 2 billion with a B.
1938, right? 36 was, this was not a hurricane. This was not a hurricane. This was a spring freshet, so not a lot of wind. More data along the river, different places at different times. Again, flood crest in 1938, flood crest in 1936 at different points. So I'll call your attention to this one. This is the Coolidge Bridge, 1936 as compared to 1938. And when I'm down in Holyoke presenting this, I point at the Holyoke. 1955 is the back-to-back hurricanes, another big event. If you geek out on this kind of history, arguably did more damage in Connecticut. Coastal hurricanes back-to-back within a month of each other. Tremendous damage. More data at different points. I want to get down into it. So I mentioned earlier that this was a pivotal moment in legislative history, and this did result in the 1936 Flood Control Act, which has evolved into what we're dealing with today. I mean, arguably it was the foundation of a lot of the work that we're doing today in terms of flood infrastructure and building systems that are managing floods, largely driven by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which was established. Anyone know when the Army Corps of Engineers was established? 1865. They've been around for a long, long time, building these systems. And I keep bumping into them in both flooding infrastructure and Cold War. They built a lot of the bunkers that come out in this book. It's an impressive organization. But you can see, just based on the contents here, how impactful around the region this particular storm was. So if you're looking for a silver lining, this was it. And you can see again, you can see the concentration in the aftermath in the 1936 flood, the major rivers and tributaries, and then other floods as well. But very highly concentrated in the New England area. The politics around this are fascinating. I won't bother you with it, but essentially what you're dealing with is agriculture and industry and government and money. Who controls the water? I mean, my wife works for a water company, and they have infrastructure in Texas. It's very complicated down there. It's complicated everywhere. It was complicated in a different way here in New England. We have water. We're just trying to figure out how to control it and how to direct it. We don't have a supply problem. We have other problems as well. But it still is important because where we are now, if you bring this to modern day for just a minute, the way the flood management systems are going are to make it more green, right? So we're not pouring concrete, we're not pouring riprap, big stones on the riverbanks. We're trying to restore the natural riverbanks because it turns out they actually work, but you can't build right alongside of them. So there's this push and pull that still resonates today. Different, but it definitely works. Different flooding infrastructure that was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. This one up on the New Hampshire side of the Connecticut River. And I think that's Nyko Dam in Huntington, if I'm not mistaken, or Worthington. Holyoke, excuse me. So you can see in the aftermath, this was damaged after the flood. And if you're familiar with downtown, all the mill buildings at this point, this was 1936, obviously. The industry had largely started to decline in this area. So this is the post-industrial revolution. The mill buildings are still there. I work a lot with a lot of the technical rescue teams and hazmat teams now, and my job now gets me access to them, and I get in there and get to work with them, and I photograph them. That's my job today. But we get to go into these buildings and into these canals. You see these opening? This is into the turbine that the water comes in from the canal, turns the turbine where they actually do the work in the mill buildings. That's still there. So we get to crawl around and get dirty and have fun in those holes. But this was in the aftermath of the Connecticut River flood. You see the residue, the debris that was left behind. They cleared that out, and now they poured concrete. And if you're familiar with different places along the Connecticut River, there are places, notably if you've been up and down Hartford on 91, look towards the riverside, and you can see it miles and miles and miles of this sort of infrastructure. Hartford, East Hartford, Northampton, Chicopee, not only on the Connecticut River, but in many places along the tributaries. The Connecticut, the Chicopee River has a lot of this infrastructure as well. This is just in Vermont, very politically contentious issue here around who owns the access to the water, the agriculture versus the industry, and who maintains control of the dam. Very complicated and contentious, bordering on violent at times. The Knightville Reservoir before and after. So you can see these locks that are built out. Going back before this, we started having the canal conversation, but 5 canals between the Long Island Sound and Canada at various points during the 1880s, starting in the early 1800s, going up through the 1880s, that were opened and closed at various times. There are other people who do the canal talk, and I find that fascinating. But there's just an example of sort of before and after. Harriman Dam, I mentioned the infrastructure on the Deerfield River. These dams were, many of them were built, many of them were overtopped, and some of them were compromised. Chicopee, this is the river walk along Chicopee downtown. I was just down there the other day looking at this, but you can kind of get a sense of this is low water in 1939. This was 1938. This was 1936. And that's the same bridge here as is here, as is here. just to give you some reference points. You can also see, because of the steep terrain and the 20 days of rain, look at that erosion. So that's going to lead to mudslides. All of those trees are gone, so when it rains again, it's going to cause ongoing problems. This is the Chicopee River section I mentioned. The tire factory. That's the backside of the tire factory in Chicopee. So again, concrete and riprap. You're like, we're not going to lose that one again. You know, they just, they built that thing. The problem with this, again, moving forward to today, that's the Chicopee River. When it floods, and it will flood again, it has flooded since, instead of this side, that's the natural, they call them nature-based solutions. This is going to slow the velocity of the water moving downstream. This is going to allow it to speed up. Velocity, it's mass times velocity squared. So we want to try to slow the water down. That's the issue. And time again, there's too many examples of this in New England, where they solve the problem by building this infrastructure. This is being a bad neighbor. We saw this in 2011 in the aftermath of Irene. It made the Gazette and the Recorder for a little bit, but the Chicopee River in Hawley was really damaged in the aftermath of Irene, and they were isolated for some time. Someone got a brilliant idea of saying, all right, we're going to fix that problem, and they poured riprap. They didn't pour concrete, but they dumped rock, and they said, we're not going to lose this one again. 6 months later, MEMA, State Emergency Management Agency, and Environmental Protections at the state level came in and go, what you guys do? You're going to have to undo that, because they took all that rock, and they were like, you just painted a long barrel down a deer field. And it did damage. And if you pay attention to what's going on with these big storm events, these pop-up events that we're getting nowadays, it transitions into what I speak to modern emergency managers and fire safety people about kind of where we're going in the future in the next 5 years. Because of events like this, communities like Deerfield are just in the crosshairs of the next big event when it happens. So don't do that anymore. This is where Route 91 would be. That's the Capitol building in Hartford. I think this is somewhere in here is the coal factory. So 91 would be going up right here now. Okay. So long story short, with all these systems, they were built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and then handed over to the local municipality, saying, look what we built for you. It's a gift. No backsies. No backsies. And that's where we're going to run into problems on the Northampton side, because when this was built in 1938 through 50, early 50s, it's been largely unmaintained. It's been there for a long time. And these systems were built for a certain, using that USGS information, no longer necessarily valid. Like, we're seeing changes in weather patterns, climate change. And these systems probably would have been designed and built differently today, right? But they weren't, and they're here now, and who knows, what would it cost to fix that? To rebuild that? And that's just one example of dozens up and down the river. Hartford, I won't talk about Hartford, but if you're familiar with downtown Hartford, and it was completely flooded and rebuilt, and they had, they used to call it the Hog River, would come into Hartford, and they had to redirect it. Almost, we're going to spend more time talking about the Mill River, but the Park River, the locals called it the Hog River. And the research in this indicated how bad it smelled. This was just people pouring raw sewage into the river and industry. You can see all the oil tanks. There was no regulation at this point, so this thing was just toxic soup. So they redirected it. Redirected the river, which is what they did in the Mill River in Northampton. Here we go, Northampton, the Mill River. Again, I think I have a map of the way the Mill River used to go. If you're familiar with downtown, it used to go where the roundhouse is now, along the backside of City Hall, down the bottom of Crafts Ave, and it would just snake along on the backside of where Thorns is now, and it just went straight out to the river. So it just continued east directly out. Now it sort of hooks a right, heads south around Smith College. That was all built. I'll show you that in just a minute. South Street Bridge. I think that building's still there. That's the backside of Old South Street. Here it is. So here, City Hall, Heart to Bis City, Northampton City Hall, built in 1850, of course. I love that building, that picture with the reflection. But that's where the Mill River used to go. That's from the flood of 1936. Here it is down here. There's the railroad tracks, which is now the rail trail. Yeah, so this is what the rail trail is now, and the Mill River was just on the south side of that. But the roundhouse used to be, that's where they stored and processed gas. Right? They turned it in, and then there was this infrastructure that would come, this is where the roundhouse would be, in these storage tanks, and the rail cars would pull up and they would put this pipe over and start filling trains with it. As one thing that they did. And I'm sure none of that coke got into the Mill River at that point. I'm sure that was completely clean, no problems. So here, we're going to start moving into today. Here is today, this is Northampton and the flood control project that was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It was started in 1939. So they started to rebuild this, and then 38 happened, and they sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. By the time they're up on their feet again, it's 1939. But it involved the flooding infrastructure and also the diversion of the Mill River. So they moved it from following along the rail trail. They diverted it at Smith College, Paradise Pond, and down towards the Oxbow. Here's an old map from, this is the original blueprint from 1939. Northampton DPW still has these, and this is just one out of hundreds. So here is the infrastructure. They're actually rebuilding it now. This is somewhere around Paradise Pond, in the area, somewhere between Paradise Pond and the Oxbow. The old steam shovels. I always like to think about what that sounded like. What did it smell like to be there? These guys are just watching it. So that's obviously along the railroad, and they're rebuilding. They're redirecting the Mill River rather, to where you see it today. This is across from Smith College. That's still there today, and you can see in the aftermath. This is all concrete, right? This is all concrete that they poured while they were doing that redirecting of the Mill River. We're going to pretty quickly get to today. There it is today. This was 2011, Irene. So instead of being on this side, that's that same electric company. Now it's the power plant for Smith College. The Mill River running behind the concrete. This system here was the first time in 50 years that this flooding infrastructure was put up. So it took Northampton DPW about 24 hours in the lead up to Irene to say, we think this is going to be the big one, and they were right. So a crew installed this system. They keep it at the DPW garage, and it took a crew many hours to install this. There's one on this side of the bridge, if you're familiar. This is West Street, and then on the other side of the bridge. So there's two. This is going back to the hidden in plain sight theme. This infrastructure is all over the place. If you're get off 91 and come up north into Northampton, you drive right through that, right? You drive right through the middle of that dike. And if you take a moment and slow down while people are honking at you, you can see there are channels in the dike where this system is designed to be put in, slid in. Okay? But it doesn't happen overnight. There's another deal of it. They actually are putting that in. So you can imagine. I mean, it takes time, but it's doable, and the system was built for it. There's notches in these walls. figure it out. They're like, all right. Anyone read the instructions on this one? So this is a modern day view of the building, just to give you a sense of what the hazards are in that area. It's obviously been built up. This building is very much still in service. More view of the Mill River, electrical infrastructure. This is all Irene again. So usually when I talk to a lot of state people about why it's important to fund these. So let me just change gears for one quick second, and I'll show you what keeps me up at night. I did, as COVID was wrapping up, I did provide testimony to state legislature committee on emergency management on these concerns, and one of the biggest issues that I called their attention to was the area I referenced at the Coolidge Bridge on the Northampton side versus the Hadley side. Let me get us up to speed here. So this kind of picks up exactly where we left off, and I'll put the hammer down for the next 10 minutes. But essentially, in the aftermath of 1936, this is a tale of two cities. The way the restoration and the recovery efforts were taken in Northampton were very different from the way they were built out on the Hadley side, right? I referenced the honey pot, and you're familiar with both sides of the bridge. This does not exist on the Hadley side, right? What exists on the Hadley side is that that concrete, or the riprap dike. That system was built in 1926, in the aftermath of the 1927 flood. All right, so very different. And what it made the Gazette, but didn't seem to concern people, concerned me. But we almost lost that thing in 2008. It just started to give way. Not a big flood event, nothing major happened. It was just noticed. I don't know who picked up on it, but it was starting to erode on the tip. So this, you can see, was 2021. There was just a big story in the Gazette about they're going to be funding, I think it's a $45 million U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project. I know there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of noise. I'm trying to pay attention to signal. I hope this one gets through. My cousin is Joe Comerford, so she always gets the everyone loves Joe, I know. Try going out for dinner with her.
Give her our love.
My cousin and I disagree on a lot, but we do agree on these matters. And she was really drove this, and we got on. She invited me to go on a Zoom meeting with all these state legislators and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I basically gave them a condensed version. This is the biggest problem in the state right now. This is hair on fire, people. And she thanked me because I don't have any affiliation anymore. I can say what I want, and they can't apparently. This is the Hadley Dike along Middle Street, right, in that area. I'll show you where this is.
West Street.
West Street, yep, thank you. Yeah. Let's see if this works. Ooh.
Oh, nice.
Oh, look at that, that one works. So you get a sense of where we were talking about. Again, the Hadley side here, the Northampton side, there's the Coolidge Bridge. So this is the area I'm talking about. That's the honey pot passing here, and this is West Street or Middle Street.
West.
Just getting mixed up. This is why they don't let me drive.
West Street, the river wants to go right.
So here it is. So again, you guys are oriented here, honey pot, Northampton, Coolidge Bridge. My thinking was that on a bad day, the water's gonna come down here, right? Seemed like, so back to your point, I'm sorry, that's where that photo was, along where there's the dike there, that's where the riprap was. And there's a walking path, and that's where that photo was. So the cemetery's on this side here. So I thought storm would come, river would rise, water would go down West Street there. Turns out what happens is this begins to fail in 2008. And my hydrogeomorphologist friends say that once this starts, there's no saying where it stops. So this is the oxbow is down here. I've all here. The next slide is the oxbow. That's the oxbow. This is north. That's how the oxbow happened. It went straight down and created that. So I'm figuring this is oxbow part 2, right? The revenge. But no, what they're telling me is that once this starts to go, and this is very low, that there's no telling where this stops. So it could take all of that. And then once it's here, it's probably not going to erode, but this whole area is going to be flooded. And they've done the math, and I have the numbers on the Northampton side and the Hadley side saying, how much is that going to cost? You know, what does that look like? I'm going to start wrapping up, but let me get you back over to Northampton, because meanwhile, back on the Northampton side, let's see what we can make this work. I don't want to waste your time, I'm sorry. On the Northampton side with the flooding infrastructure, long story short there is, they built these, where that flood infrastructure is now. In this building here, there are 3 motors, this big motors that were pulled out of tugboats, that were built in 1936. They were installed in this building, 3 of them, line to line, installed in 1940. When the water gets to a certain height and it starts to crest into the system, these pumps are turned on and they pump the water out. That's the system. That was the system. I'm sorry? Back into the Connecticut. Yeah. Back into the Connecticut. So here's the Connecticut here. So the idea is that the water comes in, and this is the lowest spot in the city, and they're pumped back out into the Connecticut. Those 3 engines on July of last year, we had one of these pop-up storms, and this transitions into what I speak to about the emergency management folks nowadays. These, in MEMA speak, and I'm not representing MEMA, just saying, but I have talked to the director of the emergency management agency, and she knows my position, and she agrees. We're having more of these pop-up storms that are unnamed storms, and they just park over communities, and they just pour water on the community for a sustained period of time, 6 inches, 8 inches of water in a few hours. It happened in Williamsburg, and the community is really just, I mean, they sidestepped a major disaster, but it was really decimating to them. And the communities on the other side barely knew about it. These are unnamed storms, and we're going to see more of these things. And my position, even before all of this noise is going on, where we are today, and as of yesterday, what's the status of FEMA? I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But even before that started, what's happening is that when a storm like that comes in, FEMA comes in and evaluates it and says, all right, how much damage was here? Do you qualify for reimbursement when you repair this? The problem is, and everyone knows this, is that FEMA does their calculation based on region and how much damage is done across an area, a county, Hampshire County, even though we don't have a real government structure, they recognize that. And they say Williamsburg wouldn't qualify because countywide it was a very small area, and so it sort of falls through this crack. So this is what Joe and I talk about over dinner, while the rest of the family rolls their eyes in the back of the head. She was great at helping to develop the state level fund that fills this gap. So at MEMA, and when I'm talking with Joe, we talk about these gap events. So they're major to Williamsburg, but no one else. So we have to recognize that and provide funding to communities like that, because we're going to see this on and on again. This is what we're looking for.
Are you saying those motors are giving way, or what? I mean, how does
Yep.
this relate to the motors?
Thank you for bringing me back on point as we reel this thing in. Thank you, ma'am. So, those 3 motors, built in 1940, installed in 1940, in July of last year, 2 of them failed. The 3rd one began to fail and was 15 minutes from failing when somehow those magicians over at the DPW in Northampton fixed it. They rigged up a fuel system. The fuel supply system failed. They brought in 5-gallon tanks of diesel. There's 2 diesel and 1 gasoline. I'm not sure which one actually was the last man standing. They brought in 5-gallon gas cans and rigged up a fuel supply system. As far as I know, and I don't have any official information, that much is true, and everyone's aware of that. They've repaired those, but they need to be replaced. They need to be replaced. There's so much infrastructure on that side. That's the lowest point in the city as compared to the Hadley side. You know what's over there. On that side, when things fail here, much different neighborhood, right? So this is Lower Con Street, Walter Salvo House here, right? Senior Center here. There, and probably the one I left them with, and I will leave you guys with today, is my biggest fear for here is that there's a dialysis center on Con Street. There, dialysis emergency planning is a whole other level of complexity, and there's a network of them, and the people who need it, need it. There's no substitute. If that one goes down, it's going to put an impact. Never mind the people who have to go down to West Springfield if that hasn't been impacted, or out to this other system. There's no substitute for it. People will die. It's that simple if they don't get that treatment. But the impact it'll place on the other dialysis network systems and the logistics of getting those people, instead of from Walter Salvo House or wherever they are in Northampton, across the street, down to Greenfield or up to Greenfield or down to West Springfield or wherever the next closest treatment center is, that's a lot of logistics that need to be worked out. So, in closing, this is the thing that keeps me up at night. Those 3 engines need to be replaced. Very expensive, in the neighborhood of $45 million from what I understand according to the front page of the Gazette. It's got to happen. On that happy note, I'll stick around as long as